Let's talk about what it takes to create a web presence. One of the problems with all of this internet nonsense is the jargon you run into. It's almost like you have to speak a different language by the time you read and learn about all these different words just to create a website on the internet. So let's demystify it by breaking it down to some simple steps. In order to have a website on the internet, there's three things you have to have. The first thing you'll have to have are some website files. These are your actual website files, the pages and images that you create with the web design program. But just having those files doesn't give you a website on the internet. It just gives you some website files, but you do need them. The other thing you'll need is a domain name. This is an address to your website so people can find your website on the internet, yourdomain.com or whatever you find that's available. Now, just having a website and having a domain won't do it because you have to store these in a special place. You have to have a hosting account. This is a special computer where your website files are stored and where your domain points so people can find you on the internet. Probably the most confusing part of all of this is that hosting piece of the puzzle. One of the problems with hosting is there's lots of different kinds of hosting, and it's just so technical. Basically, most people use a kind of hosting that's called shared hosting. In fact, probably 85% of the internet is on a shared hosting kind of account. Now, there are other kinds of hosting accounts, but they can be more expensive than shared hosting. Shared hosting is, again, the most popular and the least expensive. Where dedicated server hosting starts at about $200 a month, shared hosting runs at about $5 a month. So since it's the most common, that's the kind of hosting we're going to talk about in this video. Here's how hosting works. When you go to a web hosting company, they rent you space on a special computer called a web server. You can think of a web server as kind of an apartment building. It's a special computer that houses different websites, different web hosting accounts technically. So when you go to a web host, you're renting space on a web server, just like you would rent an apartment in an apartment building. And because this is shared hosting, there will be other people renting space on that web server. They're sort of your neighbors, except that you don't get to borrow a cup of sugar from them or see them in the hallways. Everyone has their own space, their own unique space for their website. And the web server you're sharing might have a dozen or even hundreds or even 1,000 other web hosting accounts on that same server. Now, it's important to know that the server you're on is unique. There's no other server on the internet like it. What distinguishes it is its address. Just like an apartment building would have a street address, a web server has what's called an IP address. And there is no other server on the internet with the same IP address as the one you're on. They're all unique, just like the apartment building would have. There's something else, though, that distinguishes the server, and that's called a name server. So the apartment building, or the server, would have a name as well as an address. You can kind of think of the IP address as the street address. For example, 123 Main Street, Oakdale, California. Whereas the name server part of the server, that's kind of like the name of the apartment, if we called this the Oakdale Apartments. And each web hosting account where you would store your website is sort of like renting an apartment. So you might be in apartment 4G and somebody else in apartment 2B, and other people on the server have their unique apartments, each one secured and each one locked by a different key. So a web server is, as you can see, very much like an apartment building. Now, when you go to a web hosting company and you rent space on a server, most likely they have more than one server. In fact, some web hosting companies will have dozens or even hundreds of web servers. And yet each one of these web servers has a different address, just like an apartment building would have a different street address. They may share the same name servers, or they may not. It depends on the web hosting company. The point is, you'll be renting one space on one server for your website. And that's how web hosting basically works. So we cover that part of it, and that's really the most difficult part. However, you can't get a web host until you have a domain. Why? Well, because the domain is the address to your specific apartment. It's kind of like your apartment 4G address. Yourdomain.com is the address to the space where your website will be stored. In order to get a hosting account, you have to have a domain, or you have to get your domain when you get your hosting. Domains are easy to get. Usually you go to a different company to get your domain than you do to get your hosting, but you don't have to. And when you do get a domain, you get to choose what kind of domain you want, a .com, a .net, .org, .biz. There's lots of TLDs, they're called, or top-level domains. And of course, obviously, most people like the .com, .net, .org. Whichever TLD you choose, what will happen at the domain registrar is you will find a domain that's available, because remember, no one else in the world can have the same domain as you. So when you go to register a domain, that is, purchase the right to use this domain, it has to be unique. So the domain registrar helps you find one that you like and that is available. So you're looking for a domain that only you will have. You can use letters in your domain, like mydomain.com, or you can include numbers, like myonedomain.com, and you can mix these alphanumeric characters, or you can even have hyphens or dashes, kind of like my-domain.com, or any combination of these things. But that's about it. And by the way, capital letters don't matter in a domain name. A capital M, mydomain.com, is the same as lowercase mydomain.com. So let's say you found a domain and you've registered it at your registration company. So they hold your domain for you. That's great. But how does your domain get associated with the web hosting account or the apartment that you rented? Well, it's really easy to do. This is called pointing your domain. Sometimes we call it updating our name servers or changing our DNS record. Whatever you call it, it's a pretty simple process. All you're doing is you're telling your domain registration company, hey, that domain that I registered, I want to point it to a specific web server on the internet. And the way you know what that web server is by the name servers. That's right, the name of the server that you're going to be hosting your domain on. So there's always a primary and a secondary name server. You get that information from your host, you type it in at the registration company's website, and you're done. Now you have a domain that points to the web server that you're going to host your website on. Now, like I said, usually you'd register your domain with a company like, say, GoDaddy, but you could host your website with another company. They do work together, even though they're two different companies. But not always. You can also update your DNS record yourself at your domain registration company, or you can do it all at once with the hosting company. Sometimes the hosting company will offer that service for you, where they'll register the domain for you and update your DNS record so you can skip this step. It doesn't really matter because the name server information comes from the host anyway. So if that's more convenient for you, you can go to the hosting company, register your domain, and get your hosting all in one fell swoop. Unless you already have a domain registered somewhere, then you would do it the other way. But either way, the point is you're going to be updating your domain so that it points to the right apartment building. So now you've got a domain, an apartment address. You've got a host, an apartment building you're renting space in, but it's empty. You just have an empty web hosting account. Now you have to have a website. That's what your files are. The files that you created with your web design program are the files you're going to put on your host. So how do you do that? Let's say you've built your website with web design software, for example, 90-second website builder. You want to put those files from your computer into the right apartment building so that when people go to yourdomain.com, they land on your website. It's actually really simple. And in fact, most web design programs, like 90-second website builder, have what's called a built-in FTP. FTP is a special program that stands for File Transfer Protocol. And this special program knows how to take a copy of your website files and put them on the host and put them into the right apartment building, the right hosting account where your domain is pointed. It's really simple to do. In fact, if you're using a program like 90-second website builder, you simply tell the program where your hosting account is, and every time you click the publish button, you're updating your website by sending your website files to the host. It does this because the FTP program knows your username, password, and that special IP address, the address to your hosting account. This is called uploading. Sometimes we call it publishing to the web. And every time you make a change to your website on your computer, you click the FTP button and it uploads or updates your website. So you can make changes anytime and then FTP again and update your host. So that means you always have a copy of your website on your computer as well as a copy on the host. This is the way professional websites are built. always having an offline copy and an online copy. And remember, since yourdomain.com points to the right server, when people visit yourdomain.com, they'll see those websites that you uploaded from your computer. So remember, think of the server as your apartment building and that hosting account as your specific apartment. You can think of the domain registration company as kind of the post office that makes sure everything gets forwarded to the right address when people go to your domain. You can think of the FTP program as the movers who are moving your stuff into your apartment. And the way they get in, well, they have the keys, the username, password, and IP address. This is really how it works. And once you understand this concept, you only set it up once and you're ready to go. So the next time you're thinking about creating a web presence and you run into all this jargon that's practically a different language, hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer to you now that you know a website is basically just that, a website, a domain, and a host.